My name is Ellie Marsh, and I was 31 years old when my mother called me after 22 years of silence and told me she had received a diagnosis. I want to start with the call because the call is the center of the story, even though the story begins 22 years before it. But I need you to understand something about that call before I take you back to where everything started. When my phone lit up with her name that morning, I did not feel what most people might expect. I did not feel relief. I did not feel the rush of a wound finally being addressed. I felt something quieter and more complicated than either of those things. I felt the weight of 22 years arriving in a single moment, and I felt myself making a decision about what to do with that weight before I had fully processed that the decision was being asked of me. I answered, but before I tell you what she said, I need to take you back to when I was 9 years old and my mother made the first decision, the one that made all the other decisions necessary. My mother, Sandra, was 32 when she met Robert Hale. I was 8. My parents had divorced 2 years earlier, and my father lived in another state, and my mother and I had been, for those 2 years, a unit, small and sometimes difficult, and held together by the specific, fierce love of a mother and daughter who were all each other had. I had been happy in those 2 years, in the way that children are happy when the adult they depend on is fully present. Sandra had been sad and rebuilding and learning to be a single mother and doing it imperfectly and doing it genuinely, and I had felt her there. Robert arrived, and Sandra turned toward him with the complete attention of a woman who had been lonely and had found someone who made the loneliness stop. I understood that. I understand it now more completely than I did at 9. What I could not understand then, and what I spent the following years learning the shape of, was that some people, when they turn toward a new love, turn away from something else completely. Sandra turned toward Robert and away from me, and it was not a dramatic, single turning. It was slow. It was incremental. It was the specific accumulation of 100 small choices that each seemed manageable, and together built a wall between a mother and her daughter that took 22 years to speak through. Before I tell you what that wall was made of, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city in the comments. I love knowing where you are when you listen to this. Now, let me tell you about the first brick. Robert moved in when I was 9. He was not a cruel man. I want to say that clearly because the story of a stepfather who is cruel is a different story from this one, and I want to be accurate about what actually happened because the accurate version is in some ways harder to explain than the cruel version. Cruelty is visible. What Robert did was not cruelty, it was displacement. He occupied space in my mother's life and attention in a way that left less space for me, and my mother allowed the occupation without appearing to notice what was being displaced. By the time I was 11, she had stopped coming to my school events, not all of them immediately, gradually. First, the ones that conflicted with something Robert wanted to do, then the ones that Robert found inconvenient, then most of them. My fifth-grade reading competition, my middle school graduation, the concert where I had a solo that I had practiced for 6 weeks. She always had a reason. Robert needed her. Robert was not feeling well. Robert had planned something and she could not cancel at the last minute. Robert, Robert, Robert. A name that became, in my childhood, the explanation for every absence and the reason why I was always last on the list of things that required her attention. I stopped telling her about things by the time I was 13, not as a punishment, as a protection, because telling her meant hoping she would come, and hoping she would come meant risking that she would not, and the not coming hurt more than not hoping in the first place. I learned to manage my own expectations the way children learn things they should not have to learn, silently, and without anyone noticing the learning was happening. She stopped calling me by my childhood nickname when I was 13, Ellybug. She had called me that since I was 2. Robert found it childish. She stopped. I did not say anything when she stopped. I was 13, and I had learned by then that saying things produced conversations that were ultimately about managing Robert's comfort rather than addressing anything real between us. So I filed it in the long catalog of things I was keeping, and I moved forward. I got a part-time job at 15. I bought my own clothes at 16. I managed my own calendar and my own appointments and my own everything at 17, and left at 18 with 2 bags and a partial scholarship and the specific quiet determination of a person who has understood that she is not going to be supported in the way she was supposed to be and has decided to stop waiting for it. I called my mother from the bus station. She said, "Call me when you get there." I said, "Okay." I called when I got there. She said, "Good. Robert says hello." That was the last real conversation we had for 22 years. The 22 years were not empty. I want to be clear about that because the version of this story that presents an estrangement as a void is not the true version. My 22 years were full. They were the fullest years of my life. I built a career in graphic design that I was genuinely proud of. I built friendships that had become the family I had chosen. I built a home in a city I had selected specifically because it was mine and had no history I had not created myself. I thought about my mother with the specific, intermittent grief of someone who has lost a living person. Not constantly, not always, but in the moments where the absence was most shaped. Holidays, achievements, the times when you want to call someone who has known you your entire life and tell them something that matters. I tried twice in the early years. Once at 21, when I graduated, I sent a card. She called and we spoke for 12 minutes, and Robert's name came up 4 times in 12 minutes, and I understood that nothing had changed, and I stopped trying. Once at 25, when I was promoted, I sent an email. She replied warmly and mentioned that Robert had also had a good year at work, and I closed the email and did not reply. And that was the last time I initiated contact. I do not tell you this to make Sandra the villain of those 22 years. I tell you because I want you to understand that I did not simply disappear. I tried. I tried at the moments when trying felt most legitimate and most likely to produce something real. And both times I found the same answer. Robert was still the center. I was still the periphery. The wall was still there. And I had a life to build, and I was going to build it regardless of whether she was going to be part of it. My therapist, a woman named Dr. Reyes, who I had been seeing for 4 years, said to me once that estrangement is not the opposite of love. She said, estrangement is what love looks like when it has been refused so many times that maintaining the refusal requires more energy than the person has available. She said, you did not stop loving your mother. You stopped absorbing the cost of a relationship that was not being reciprocated. I have thought about that sentence many times. It is the truest description of the 22 years I have found. I was 31 years old, 6 months into a new apartment and a new project at work, on a Tuesday morning making coffee, when my phone lit up with a number I had not deleted because deleting it had felt too final and I had never quite arrived at final. Sandra. My mother's name on my screen at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning after 22 years. I let it ring twice. Not because I was deciding whether to answer, because I needed 2 rings to get from the kitchen counter to the chair at my table where I wanted to be when I had this conversation. I had not known I was going to have this conversation until that moment, but I had known, somewhere in the way you know things you have been carrying for a long time, that if the call ever came, I would want to be sitting down for it. I answered. I said, "Hello." Not Mom, not Sandra. Hello. The specific, neutral greeting of a person who is not going to perform warmth they have not yet established is warranted. She said, "Ellie." Her voice was older. Of course it was older. 22 years is a long time, and voices carry years in them. But it was also, underneath the age, recognizable. The voice of the woman who had called me Ellie Bug,
who had been fully present for 8 years before she was not. She said, "I got some news." I said, "Okay." She said, "I was diagnosed last week." She named the diagnosis. I am not going to name it here because it belongs to her and not to this story. What I will tell you is that it was serious, and that it was the kind of serious that changes how a person sees time. She said, "I thought about calling you for the past week." She said, "I did not know if you would answer." I said, "I answered." She said, "I am not calling to ask you for anything." She said it in the careful way of someone who has rehearsed and is trying to establish something early. I said, "Okay." She said, "I just wanted you to know." I said, "Why?" Long pause. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Because you are my daughter." I sat with that. I held the phone and I looked at the window and I sat with those 4 words for about 5 seconds. You are my daughter. Voice breaks. I said, "Sandra." She said, "I know you call me Sandra now." I said, "Mom." I said it once, 1 word. She made a sound I cannot fully describe, something between a breath and a sob, something that had 22 years in it. I said, "I heard you." I said, "I'm going to need some time before I know what I want to say." She said, "I understand." I said, "I want you to know one thing right now." She said, "Okay." I said, "I never stopped." She knew what I meant. She said, "I know." She said, "I did not either." Angry tone. I wanted to say, "Then why?" I wanted to ask the question I had been carrying for 22 years. Why did you choose him? Why did you keep choosing him? Why was I always the thing that got adjusted when adjustments needed to be made? I did not ask it. Not that day. That day, I said, "I will call you this week." She said, "Okay." I said, "I'm glad you called." I meant it. I hung up and I sat at my kitchen table and I cried for the first time in a long time, and the crying had 22 years in it, and a 9-year-old girl in it, and 8 minutes with no calls returned, and a nickname that disappeared, and a bus station, and a part-time job, and a career, and a home, and a life I had built so completely that it had almost stopped feeling like compensation and had started feeling like just my life. Almost. Deep breath. I called Dr. Reyes that afternoon.
Dr. Reyes said, "What do you want to do? Not what should you do, not what does she deserve, what do you want to do?" She asked it the way she asked all the questions that mattered, directly and without suggesting an answer, because the answer had to be mine to be real. I said, "I want to know if she understands what happened, not from guilt, not as a condition, because if I'm going to put energy into this, I need to know that she has some understanding of what the energy is repairing." She said, "Can you ask her that?" I said, "I think so." I called my mother the following Thursday. We talked for an hour, not about the diagnosis, about everything else, about Robert, who she was still with, and who was still present in her life in the same central way, which I had accepted as simply true, rather than something that would or should change, about the years, about the things she had missed, about what it had felt like from her side, which was different from my side in the specific way that the same events look different from different positions, and which I listened to without immediately correcting, because listening first is the thing that makes correction worth anything. She said, "I knew I was not doing it right." She said, "I told myself it would sort itself out." She said, "Robert needed so much from me, and I did not have enough to give both of you what you needed, and I chose wrong." She said it plainly, not as a speech, as a fact she had been holding for 22 years and was putting down. I said, "I know." I said, "I needed you to say it." She said, "I am sorry, Ellie." She said my name the way she had said it when I was small, with the weight of someone who knows exactly who they are talking to. I said, "I know you are." We did not resolve 22 years in one phone call. I want to be clear about that, because stories that resolve in a single conversation are not honest, and I would rather be honest.
We resolved enough to make another call possible, and then another. Sandra and I talk now, twice a week, on Tuesday evenings and Saturday mornings. Robert is still there and is still mentioned, and I have made a decision to let him exist in the peripheral way of someone who is part of her life without needing to be the center of mine. The diagnosis is being treated. The prognosis is uncertain in the way that all serious medical situations are uncertain, and I have made peace with the uncertainty in the specific way of a person who spent 22 years making peace with things she could not control. I do not know what the future of this relationship looks like. I know what today looks like, which is 2 phone calls a week and an honest conversation, and a mother who says my name the way she used to, and a daughter who answers when the phone rings. That is not everything I needed when I was 9. It is what is available now. And I have learned across 31 years of building what was available into something real that available is not nothing. Available is the beginning of something. If you are the child your parent chose last, this story is for you. You did not deserve to be last. You were never last because of what you were worth. You were last because of what they were working with, and what they were working with was never about you. Build your life. Answer the phone if you want to. Do not answer it if you are not ready. Both are allowed. Both are yours. That is my story. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop your city in the comments. Hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.